6. Against each other. Interpersonal considerations. That trophy is the truth, the only truth. I told him to get mean, punish some people, put some fear into them. You have to hate to win, it takes hate to win. I didn't tell him to break anybody's ribs. I told him there is no such thing as second place. The coach in Jason Miller's that championship season. Poisoning our relationships. The bug that is going around the office doesn't remain confined to the office for long. Someone brings it home, and the whole family comes down with it. The disease that starts in the workplace is carried into living rooms and bedrooms. The disease is competition. In a society that trains us to regard our workmates as adversaries, we find no sanctuary in the private sphere. Industrial man, consciously or unconsciously, often considers not only his business rivals as competitors but also his sex partners, siblings, neighbors, and peers of his group, wrote Walter Weishaupt some 35 years ago. Never mind the office. The race to win is underway where you live. The pursuit of a lover is a competitive game in which success is called scoring. Would-be suitors jockey for position to take the prize, and they regard each other with suspicion or outright animosity. A couple forms, and the two find their love frayed by the need of each to outdo the other. Who has the bigger paycheck, the most friends, the sharper wit? Who is giving more to the relationship, is more skillful or selfless in bed, has sacrificed more to be with the other? It is quite sufficient for one partner to see life as a zero-sum game, and one may rest assured that things will go all to hell, says Paul Watzlawick. Let one lover be concerned with outdoing the other in some respect, any respect, and the relationship will be dragged down. A child is born and with it two questions: who will be the better parent and whom will the child prefer? The ancient competition for the children between mother and father gains renewed vigor, said Jules Henry, and the competitiveness in our culture from which the family is supposed to give shelter enters through the back door. Another child arrives and is subtly encouraged to compete with the sibling to be mommy's or daddy's favorite. Affection becomes a scarce commodity, something one must obtain at the expense of someone else. The parents socialize with other parents and trot out their children's accomplishments. Whose infant walked first, whose toddler came out with the most precious remark, whose teenager was admitted to the best college. The couples also compete to prove they have the best marriage. As Mary Lou Weissman observes, it seems we are so essentially a capitalistic society that we can't even refrain from trying to sell one another our marriages, or at least we can't resist advertising them. We are after all a highly competitive society. We compete at work, at school, in sports and on television game shows. All of these are but pale imitations of the competitions that are played on Saturday nights on a field of hors d'oeuvres. The measure of our domestic untranquility is the number of articles in the women's magazines on the subject. 17 and Glamour and Mademoiselle tell of competitions with best friends and boyfriends. Redbook and McCall's warn of familial struggles. The headlines read, "Can you bear it when your best friend gets ahead?" and "The Marriage Super Bowl," and "How to Cope with Friendly Competition." Even if we are not involved in the marketplace, these articles remind us, our personal lives are rife with rivalries. In an essay on the relationship between neurosis and American culture, Karen Horney summed up the situation. The character of all our human relationships is molded by a more or less outspoken competition. It is effective in the family between siblings, at school, in social relations, keeping up with the Joneses, and in love life. The genuine erotic wish is often overshadowed or replaced by the merely competitive goal of being the most popular, having the most dates, love letters, lovers, being seen with the most desirable man or woman. Marriage partners, for example, may be living in an endless struggle for supremacy, with or without being aware of the nature or even of the existence of this combat. This state of affairs, Horney notes elsewhere, is all the more tragic since the same competitive forces in our society that generate anxiety, making our relationships so important as a coping mechanism, also undermine these very relationships. In a competitive society, there is nowhere left to turn. Competition acts not only to strain our existing relationships to the breaking point, but also to prevent them from developing in the first place. Camaraderie and companionship, to say nothing of genuine friendship and love, scarcely have a chance to take root when we are defined as competitors. In the workplace, one tries to remain on friendly terms with one's colleagues, but there is guardedness, a part of the self held in reserve. Even when no rivalry exists at the moment, one never knows whom one will have to compete against next week. I was recently told that extended training seminars for computer programmers are sometimes set up as contests. One's ultimate status and salary are determined by how many programs one produces. The result, according to one reluctant participant, is that friendships are nipped in the bud because each person must try to outdo the others. Performing artists similarly find it hard to enjoy each other's company since they may audition for the same part or position. Says one actress, "I keep a distance from everybody because I know one day," she snaps her fingers, "it's all going to be gone and you're going to be working against each other." On the competitive playing field, the story is much the same. The occasional real friendship that develops is the exception that proves the rule. One article about professional tennis paraphrases an official as follows: "If it comes down to choosing between winning and maintaining a friendship, successful players sacrifice the friendship." He adds, "There's no place for sentiment. It's a matter of survival." The win/lose structure inevitably affects the priorities and temperaments of the individual players, according to sports psychologists Bruce Ogilvie and Thomas Tutko. A personality profile administered to 15,000 athletes revealed low interest in receiving support and concern from others, low need to take care of others, and low need for affiliation. Such a personality, the researchers conclude, seems necessary to achieve victory over others. Another study found that characteristics such as kindness, sympathy, and unselfishness are notably absent among successful athletes. Psychotherapist Lillian Rubin describes how such a personality likely takes shape. To win for his team, a boy beats his best friend. So, winning means also losing something precious in the relationship with a friend. For it is not likely that the two will compete on the football field and have a close and loving relationship off it, not likely that they can put on a show of invincibility during the game, and share their fears and vulnerabilities after it. Not very different, is it, from the world of work for which he is destined? Not very good training, is it, for the kind of sharing of self and emotional support friendship requires. The assertion one sometimes hears to the effect that competition need not interfere with friendship assumes that our orientation towards someone can switch from supportive to rivalrous and back again, as if we were changing television channels. It is simply unrealistic to think that the hostility engendered by an experience during a contest will evaporate into thin air, leaving the relationship between the two individuals unaffected. I do not mean to say that no one has ever had a satisfying relationship with a competitor, but that competition inhibits such relationships, just as it corrodes the relationships we have already developed. This chapter is concerned with the reason this happens and the consequences it brings. Anatomy of a rival. Simply from knowing that competition damages self-esteem, we can predict that relationships will be in trouble. This seems to follow from Harry Stack Sullivan's comment in the last chapter to the effect that it is difficult for me to feel good about others when I don't feel good about myself. I feel my worth is in doubt, it is contingent on winning, so I am unable to extend myself to you. From her research with children, psychologist Carol Ames concluded that just such a connection between self-esteem and relationship exists. The experience of failure in competitive settings that resulted in depressed beliefs in their own ability is likely to affect negatively the child's own feelings of competence and self-worth and potentially interfere with future relationships with others. But the interpersonal consequences of competition do not depend solely on the psychology of the individual. Competition by its very nature damages relationship. Its nature, remember, is mutually exclusive goal attainment, which means that competitors' interests are inherently opposed. I succeed if you fail, and vice versa, so my objective is to do everything possible to trip you up. This attitude does not reflect a neurotic or sadistic orientation on my part. It is the heart of competition itself, because competition decrees that both of us cannot succeed. This effect is easiest to see where we compete face to face, but even where the contest is indirect, such as the diffuse pursuit of a consumer's dollar in which market share is gained at the expense of anonymous competitors, I will regard others, and correctly so, as stumbling blocks on my path. Under conditions of competition, the failure of others has the same relative effect as one's own success. So the failure of others is devoutly to be wished. It is a small step from wanting someone else to fail at a particular task to wanting bad things in general for that person. I come to associate your disappointment with my pleasure, even when we are not in a zero-sum situation. It is another small step to adopting an adversarial posture all the time. One fails to distinguish between those others who are rivals and those who are not, at least for the moment. Put the two tendencies together, and the pattern of behavior that emerges is one of treating virtually everyone as inimical to one's own goals and wishing them ill. In a competitive culture, writes Henry, anybody's success at anything is one's own defeat, even though one is completely uninvolved in the success. Earlier I referred to a study demonstrating that American children often choose to take away another child's toy despite the fact that they have nothing to gain from this. The experiment, with 7 to 9-year-olds, found that 78% of the Anglo-American children, who presumably had become well accustomed to competition, took the other child's toy away for no other reason than to prevent the other child from having it. Mexican children, whose socialization had been less competitive, did so only half as often. Indiscriminate rivalrous behavior can be explained according to simple principles of learning theory. Baby Albert, the hapless subject of John B. Watson's classic 1920 experiment, was exposed to a loud noise every time he saw a white rat. He thereby learned to fear the rat, but also, though unexpectedly, to generalize this fear to everything furry. It is much the same for the rest of us. When we repeatedly encounter people under competitive conditions, we will spontaneously begin to regard all others as rivals and treat them accordingly. Learning theory cannot capture the full import of this point, however. We need a model of human relationship, its potential richness and significance to our lives, against which to understand the effects of competition. The philosopher Martin Buber spent his life devising such a model. For him, the fulfillment of human life was relationship, the realm of the interhuman. Buber described the wondrous possibility of treating another person not as an it, but as a thou, not as a means but as an end, so that each becomes aware of the other, and is thus related to him in such a way that he does not regard and use him as his object, but as his partner in a living event. This possibility depends on my coming to understand our common humanity, which is to say, coming to see that your needs and feelings are analogous to my own. Now clearly I know myself as a center of experience, the one who perceives and acts in and reflects on a world. All of existentialist thought is a kind of rebellion against the intellectual systems and real-world practices that crush or deny my subjectivity by reducing me to a part of a crowd, a scientific datum, a pale approximation of some transcendent reality. What Buber adds to this assertion of my subjectivity is the necessity of affirming your subjectivity as well. You are not just a part of my world but the center of your own. Some night while you are driving along a highway, try to imaginatively capture the reality of the other drivers. Each set of headlights represents a person who is, like you, on her way somewhere. In other situations, look deeply into someone's eyes and try to grasp the fact that this is a person who is not just being watched but is a watcher, just like you. If you succeed at reclaiming the subjectivity of the other, you will be unable to hurt him, or even to dismiss him. You can dismiss an abstraction, a jock, some bureaucrat, that schizophrenic. You can mistreat an object, a piece of ass, a terrorist. But as soon as you come upon a human being, you will be moved to share yourself with him, to care for him. It will be far more difficult to hurt his feelings or ignore him, or simply analyze him. It will be almost impossible to kill him or cheer his death, which is why this sort of orientation can put armies out of business. Kafka once said that war is caused by a monstrous lack of imagination. It should be clear now that he meant the ability to imagine the subjectivity of others. To say that you and I share a common humanity, however, is not to say that we are the same. On the contrary, I must encounter you as an other rather than as a mirror of myself or an object of my own experience. Empathy, in the sense of picturing myself in your situation, is not enough. The point is to see your situation from your perspective, which is not identical with mine. I must imagine the real, see the world as you do, experience your inner life. This, according to Buber, is a bold swinging, demanding the most intensive stirring of one's being, into the life of the other. When I both regard you as a subject and recognize your otherness, there is the making of human relationship at its fullest. All of us can strive to receive others this way, and in so doing we prepare the ground for genuine dialogue, a reciprocal sharing by which both participants are enriched. The ideal of human relationship that Buber describes is, of course, only imperfectly realized. There are circumstances, both internal and external, that interfere with our coming to see another person as different from ourselves and as a subject. Our own needs can drown out the other's cry. The frantic pace of modern life can divert us from the other's humanity. But had we set out deliberately to sabotage relationship, we could hardly have done better than to arrange for people to have to compete against each other. At this point, let me recall the distinction between pursuing a goal independently and pursuing it competitively. Obviously, the former is not conducive to relationships since interaction is ruled out. My success and your success are totally separate, so I don't have to have anything to do with you. But competition entails a kind of perverse interdependence. Our fates are linked in that I cannot succeed unless you fail. Thus I regard you merely as someone over whom to triumph. Because you are my rival, you are to me, an object, something I use for my own ends. This dynamic is found in virtually all exploitative relationships. All too commonly, for example, a bus driver is seen solely in terms of his function. He gets us from here to there. To the extent we perceive him this way, essentially as an appendage of the bus itself, we cannot enter into dialogue with him. But competition takes objectification a step further, since I not only use you but try to defeat you. True, you regard me in the same way, and this creates a symmetry that is not present in, say, the boss's relationship to his worker. But it is a fearful symmetry. For competitors, the objectification is doubled. The prospects for relationship are twice buried. The reductio ad absurdum of competition is war, and it is here that we find antagonists most thoroughly negating the humanity of others in order to be able to kill them. One fires on krauts or gooks, not on people. But precisely the same process is in evidence in less deadly kinds of competition. Tennis players imagine a faceless opponent, says one sports psychologist. Adds another. The more you get involved with playing a personality, the worse you do. A pro football player writes, "We were really fired up and felt we were going to annihilate them. I particularly didn't want to see their faces, because the more anonymous they were the better it was for me, and I'm sure most of the other ball players felt the same way. They were a faceless enemy we had to meet." Depriving adversaries of personalities, of faces, of their subjectivity, is a strategy we automatically adopt in order to win. Some people do this more effectively than others, but the posture is demanded by the very structure of competition. We may try to reassure ourselves with talk about friendly competition, but the fact remains that seeing another person as a rival and seeing her as a partner in a living event are fundamentally incompatible stances. It is difficult to imagine a more telling indictment of an activity than the fact that it demands such depersonalization. There is some empirical confirmation of this phenomenon. A series of 10 studies conducted by David and Roger Johnson investigated the effect of various learning environments on perspective taking, that is, on the ability to understand how a situation appears to another person and how that person is reacting cognitively and emotionally to the situation. The studies show that cooperative learning experiences promote greater cognitive and effective perspective taking than do competitive or individualistic learning experiences. In one recent experiment, for example, undergraduates played at managing businesses and had to negotiate with one another. Those playing under competitive conditions were less able to take the other company's perspective, which here was defined in terms of something as simple as understanding how many assets the other had. What is true of a competitive situation may well be true of a competitive individual. Mark Barnett and his associates asked first-grade teachers to rate their students with respect to competitiveness. Then the experimenters administered a well-tested measure of empathy in which subjects were asked for their feelings after watching slides of same-age children who seemed happy, sad, angry, or fearful. The result: children rated as highly competitive were found to have lower empathy scores than children rated as relatively less competitive. Of course, the absence of basic empathy precludes anything like the sort of relationship of which Buber spoke, but it has another, more easily observed, effect, as well. It means that one is less likely to help others. We are especially inclined to assist people when we can imaginatively experience what they are going through. If empathy encourages altruism and competition depresses empathy, then we should find an inverse relationship between competition and altruism, and so we do. There is considerable evidence to suggest that cooperative settings, when compared to competitive settings, promote more mutual liking, more sharing, and more helping behaviors, writes Carol Ames. A 1968 study of nursery schoolboys found that those who were less generous in giving away candies also seemed more competitive, while playing a racing game with dolls. Conversely, wrote the experimenters, high generosity seems to be part of a pattern which involves less intense interpersonal competition. Another pair of researchers confirmed this effect with fifth-grade boys several years later. After playing a bowling game and receiving some tokens, each child was permitted, in the experimenter's absence, to contribute some of them to a March of Dimes canister. Those who were told they had won gave away more than those who were told they had lost or tied. But those who had played non-competitively contributed the most of all. This finding is not very surprising, the experimenters note, since charitable or helping behaviors, by definition, are antithetical to competitive behaviors. The point here is not that competitive individuals never give money to charity. It is rather that competition ultimately discourages generosity. While we pay lip service to helping people in our culture, or write an occasional check to the United Way, our fundamental orientation toward others is trying to beat them. Because success seems to entail this, we subtly discourage our children from being too concerned about the welfare of others. Parents generally want their children to be able to compete successfully. And how can they compete if they're altruists? Asks Maya Pines rhetorically. Now it may be possible to fall short of Buberian dialogue while still coexisting amicably. But competition's effects run far deeper than simply closing off an ideal. It tends to turn our relationships into something distinctly unpleasant. Here again is Karen Horney. Competitiveness creates easily aroused envy towards the stronger ones, contempt for the weaker, distrust towards everyone, so the satisfaction and reassurance which one can get out of human relations are limited and the individual becomes more or less emotionally isolated. Let us take these three consequences, envy, contempt, and distrust, in turn. To envy another person is to want what he has and to resent him for having it. As is usual for familiar and disturbing characteristics, we tend to assume that this is part of human nature. But desire is largely a social creation, and so is the distribution of what is valued. Competition creates a prize status where none existed before, thereby giving us something to desire. Then it ensures that not everyone can get it. Finally, competition requires that those who obtain the reward can do so only by defeating everyone else. Both the objective and subjective conditions for envy are established, in other words, restricted access to something desired and a, quite accurate, belief that someone else has got it at one's own expense. Even if no social arrangement could do away with a taste for what others have, competition adds the sour flavor of resentment. It is the latter that spoils relationship. Indeed, Bertrand Russell once wrote, "There is, so far as I know, no way of dealing with envy except to make the lives of the envious happier and fuller, and to encourage in youth the idea of collective enterprises rather than competition." Contempt for others is induced by competition in two ways. First, envy for what the winners have, and bitterness at their having it, easily congeals into enmity. Jules Henry spoke of how we encourage this feeling in the classroom, since all but the brightest children have the constant experience that others succeed at their expense, they cannot help but develop an inherent tendency to hate the success of others, to hate others who are successful, and to be determined to prevent it. Along with this, naturally, goes the hope that others will fail. The second kind of contempt, the sort that Horney had in mind, is directed at the losers. It derives from the effort of winners, and here we may specifically point to the economically privileged, to justify their success by maintaining that winning is their natural reward for being winners. This is not a tautology. Certain people are believed to enjoy the status of being winners in advance of actually winning. These winners are good people, not only capable but virtuous, and their victories are therefore always deserved. The corollary to this is that those who lose deserve their fate, too, and merit only contempt. We usually do not spell out these assumptions, but they color our perception of winning and losing. They probably are the legacy of social Darwinism, which, as the historian Richard Hofstadter pointed out, supplied the competitive order with a cosmic rationale. Competition was glorious. Just as survival was the result of strength, success was the reward of virtue. George Orwell, reflecting on his school days, put it this way: virtue consisted in winning. Life was hierarchical, and whatever happened was right. There were the strong, who deserved to win and always did win, and there were the weak, who deserved to lose and always did lose, everlastingly. Despite the outrageous arrogance of this view, winners are sometimes successful in persuading losers of its validity. This has two consequences. 1. The losers' contempt for the winners is mixed with self-contempt, and 2. The losers will set about not to change the system, a move that would in any case be dismissed as sour grapes, but only to become a winner next time. Thus there is no one to press for structural change. The contempt for losers, then, not only tears at the fabric of human relationship but functions as a powerfully conservative force. Finally, there is the matter of distrust. Love, of course, is based on trust, but so, to a lesser extent, is our ability to function in any social system. Even if we are mere acquaintances, you and I expect certain things from, and are vulnerable to, each other. But set up a system where we must compete against each other, and a breeding ground for distrust has been established. Indeed, why should you trust me if I have every reason to want you to fail? Distrust spreads rapidly, too. First, because I am never sure that you might not become my rival even if you are not at present. Second, because, as discussed earlier, we generalize what we learn to new environments. And third, because a vicious circle is generated, in which I respond in kind to your attitude. Disclosing myself to others can be considered a key element of psychological health and is, at any rate, an important part of relationship. But competition erodes the trust on which disclosure depends. Whatever I tell you about myself or do to help you will, in a zero-sum situation, be at my own expense. In a competitive culture, we come to look at each other through narrowed eyes. When we compete, then, we objectify others, lose our ability to empathize, become less inclined to help. A chasm opens up between us, leaving us distrustful, envious, and contemptuous. The father of family therapy, Nathan Ackerman, saw the sad legacy of competition in the home. The strife of competition reduces empathic sympathy, distorts communication, impairs the mutuality of support and sharing, and decreases the satisfaction of personal need. All of this may well result in isolation, as Horney contended, which suggests the provocative hypothesis that competition is not only the result of hyperindividualism but its cause. The chief result of competition, though, as Ackerman observed and as should by now be clear, is strife. Competition of any kind is a sort of battle, a hostile encounter. The following section will investigate this closely. Aggression. What is the relationship between competition and aggression? On one level, the question makes little sense since the two are not really distinct phenomena that can be related. Competition is a kind of aggression. In the preceding section, I tried to explore what it means to try to beat someone. The arrangement is by its very nature a struggle, or, depending on how one uses the word, an aggressive enterprise. Thus Horney was able to write, "Hostility is inherent in every intense competition, since the victory of one of the competitors implies the defeat of the other. If there is a connection to be drawn, then, it is only between trying to defeat someone and trying to do him harm beyond what is necessary for victory. The mediator between these two actions presumably would be feelings of hostility, which invariably attend competition at some level." Morton Deutsch writes as follows: "In a competitive relationship, one is predisposed to affect the other negatively, to have a suspicious, hostile, exploitative attitude toward the other, to be psychologically closed to the other, to be aggressive and defensive toward the other, to seek advantage and superiority for self and disadvantage and inferiority for the other, to see the other as opposed to oneself and basically different, and so on. One is also predisposed to expect the other to have the same orientation. Indeed, hostility is practically indistinguishable from intentional competition, so an individual with this orientation will likely seek out competitive encounters. To this extent, the act of competition can be a consequence of hostility. But social scientists have been more concerned with the reverse proposition, the question of whether competition leads people to feel more hostile and, ultimately, to act more aggressive. Once upon a time, theorists speculated that participation in or controlled exposure to competitive sports or other aggressive behavior would drain off one's reservoir of aggression. This came to be known as the catharsis theory, after Aristotle's notion that one can be purged of unpleasant emotions by watching tragic dramas. Freud and the ethologist Konrad Lorenz were two of the chief proponents of this view, and it is not a coincidence that both believed aggression was innate rather than learned and spontaneous rather than reactive. We naturally need to vent our aggressions, and it is best to do so where it can do little harm, such as by playing sports. The substitutive satisfaction of competition thus was said to reduce aggression. There are few beliefs so widely held by the general public that have been so decisively refuted by the evidence. The catharsis theory by now has no leg to stand on, particularly with respect to the question of sports. Even Lorenz told an interviewer in 1974 that he had developed strong doubts whether watching aggressive behavior even in the guise of sport has any cathartic effect at all. And the well-known psychoanalyst Bruno Bettelheim conceded that competitive or spectator sports raise aggressive feelings of competition to the boiling point. Watching others be aggressive does not discharge our own aggressiveness. What seems to happen instead is straightforward modeling. We learn to be aggressive. Our restraints against aggression are lowered. Whatever explanation we devise for this effect, however, one study after another has failed to show any catharsis effect. Athletes were found to become more aggressive over the course of a season, as measured by personality tests. Another study found the same thing for high school football players. Third graders who were frustrated by experimenters did not become any less aggressive when they engaged in aggressive play afterward. On the other hand, those children who had the frustrating behavior explained to them became significantly less aggressive. Elementary school-aged boys were more likely to shove or hit their peers if they had watched a boxing film. A cross-cultural study revealed that where we find warlike behavior we typically find combative sports, and where war is relatively rare combative sports tend to be absent. This refutes the hypothesis that combative sports are alternatives to war as discharge channels of accumulated aggressive tension. If the catharsis theory were true, sports and war would be inversely related across cultures. In fact, they are directly related. Those social scientists who have reviewed or conducted the research on catharsis speak with one voice. Innumerable studies of aggression in children have illustrated that attempts to reduce aggression through the use of aggressive and vigorous play therapy have the opposite effect. Sports participation may heighten aggressive tendencies, says one. Engaging in aggressive sports or observing aggressive sports typically leads to increased rather than decreased aggression, says another. Participation in competitive, aggressive sports may more rightfully be viewed as a disinhibition training that ultimately promotes violent reactions, says a third. And from yet another source, the balance of evidence is that sports involvement may heighten arousal, produce instances of aggressive behaviors and their reward, and provide a context in which the emulation of such behaviors is condoned. Faced with such evidence, proponents of competition can no longer use catharsis to justify the aggressiveness of sports. Their last refuge is, as usual, the myth of human nature. Michael Novak, for instance, asserts that the human animal is a warlike animal, and that sports merely dramatize conflict. But whether or not we are unavoidably aggressive, and the data suggests that we are not, one cannot argue in good faith that sports merely dramatize conflict. The studies demonstrate that athletic competition not only fails to reduce aggression, as catharsis theory would predict, but actually encourages it. This is not really surprising given that sport represents a kind of circumscribed warfare, something pointed out not only by such critics as George Orwell, who called it war minus the shooting, but also by generals. It was Wellington who said that the Battle of Waterloo was won on the playing fields of Harrow and Eton. It was Douglas MacArthur who said, "Upon the fields of friendly strife are sown the seeds that, upon other fields, on other days, will bear the fruits of victory." And it was Eisenhower who said that the true mission of American sports is to prepare young people for war. The point is not that athletes will rush to enlist, but that athletic competition both consists in and promotes warlike aggression. There have been numerous anecdotal and experimental accounts of the relationship between violence and sports, but probably the most famous investigation was the series of studies conducted between 1949 and 1954 by Muzaffar Sharif and his colleagues. In the so-called Robbers Cave experiment, named after the area of Oklahoma where it took place, the researchers took a group of normal 11 and 12-year-old boys at a Boy Scout camp and divided them into two teams. These teams, the Rattlers and the Eagles, lived for 3 weeks in separate cabins and were pitted against each other in such competitive games as baseball, football, and tug-of-war, with prizes for the winning team. The hypothesis was that situations where one group could be successful only at the expense of the other, i.e., competition, would promote generalized hostility and aggressive acts. This is exactly what happened. The boys began taunting and insulting each other, in some cases turning against good friends who were now on the opposing team. They burned each other's banners, planned raids, threw food, and attacked each other after the games and at night. It is important to realize that there was no difference between the members of the two teams. They were in all respects homogeneous. Only the fact of structural competition can account for this hostility. The practice of dividing children into teams for a series of competitive encounters is still common in summer camps. These teams often are identified by colors, and the affair is aptly known as color war. It is a dreadful spectacle, a study in humiliation and rage, which I witnessed over several years as a camp counselor. Even very young children understand that the only thing that matters during the war is the relative standing of their team. Everything must be sacrificed for the Blues or Whites, and fervent loyalties develop as soon as the arbitrary team assignments are announced. Erstwhile friends on the other side are now met with a coldness that often erupts into nastiness. In the camp where I worked, the competition extended beyond sports. Writing cheers and participating in a sort of quiz bowl ensured that non-athletic youngsters, too, could use their skills in rivalrous fashion. Indeed, one regularly finds hostility boiling up in chess matches, interscholastic debates, and any other sort of recreational competition one cares to mention. Athletes have no patent on aggression. Competition does not promote aggression merely on the part of participants. Fan violence is a frequent companion to sports, from high school students pelting the opposing team's bus with rocks to the death of 300 soccer fans in a 1964 brawl in Peru. In 1971, 66 people died in similar fashion in Glasgow. In 1985, it was 38 in Brussels. Looting and rioting regularly occur in U.S. cities following a hometown victory in the Super Bowl or World Series. After each such incident, Pundits and political leaders scratched their heads and tried to imagine what could have caused such senseless behavior. The Brussels riot, begun by Liverpool youths, produced hypotheses ranging from alcohol to the British character. The one cause that was not considered was the effect of competition itself. In any case, the frequency of such behavior on the part of fans again disproves the catharsis theory. There are so many cases of spectators becoming violent as a result of an emotionally pitched game, says Terry Orlick, that we have to wonder why the notion persists that the viewers will lessen their aggressive inclinations by seeing the game. Clearly, someone forgot to tell these fans that watching highly competitive or aggressive sports is supposed to subdue their aggressive tendencies. It would be a mistake to confine a discussion of competitively inspired aggression to sports. Games, after all, are supposed to matter less than the rest of life. They are offered as something playful and fun. In other arenas, where competition is in deadly earnest, there may be fewer displays of brute violence, but there is at least as much hostility. Joseph Wax's reflections on education are worth quoting at length. One must marvel at the intellectual quality of a teacher who can't understand why children assault one another in the hallway, playground, and city street, when in the classroom the highest accolades are reserved for those who have beaten their peers. In many subtle and some not so subtle ways, teachers demonstrate that what children learn means less than that they triumph over their classmates. Is this not assault? Classroom defeat is only the pebble that creates widening ripples of hostility. It is self-perpetuating. It is reinforced by peer censure, parental disapproval, and loss of self-concept. If the classroom is a model, and if that classroom models competition, assault in the hallway should surprise no one. We are back to the inescapable fact of generalization. What we are taught is appropriate in one situation does not remain confined there. Competition spreads to other arenas, assumes other forms, and along with it, as part of a package deal, goes aggression. One interesting bit of evidence here relies on an empirical tool known as the F-scale that was devised by the social theorist Theodor Adorno and his colleagues some years ago. People whose answers to certain questions led to their being classified as high on the scale were said to be aggressive as well as destructive, cynical, authoritarian in their thinking, and enamored of power and toughness, among other things. Harold Kelly and Anthony Stahelski, in an influential 1970 article based on Prisoner's Dilemma research, concluded that persons low on the F-scale and similar personality measures are like the cooperative persons identified in the present game research, while high scorers on the F-scale seem to correspond to the competitive type. I cite this correlational finding because it pertains to long-term personality patterns, something about which, at least with respect to competition, we have little data. As we have already seen, though, there is good evidence of a causal link between competition and aggression. Some have explained this evidence in terms of the theory that aggression results from frustration. Originally, the connection was proposed in just such simple terms. Today, the paradigm has been refined. Many theorists propose that competition generates a high level of arousal, meaning that we may not immediately become aggressive as a result, but that we are predisposed to respond in this way if we are then frustrated by something. Of course, most of us encounter frustrations all the time, so the competition-aggression link remains fairly solid. This theory neatly explains why losers become aggressive, but it raises the question of why winners, or fans of winning teams, do so as well. In an experiment with 5- and 6-year-olds, Janice Nelson and her associates found that success as well as failure in competition produced consistent increases in aggression, as compared with the effects of non-competitive play, although failure made the children more aggressive. Another study, which first involved watching an adult be aggressive, discovered that the boys who won a subsequent competition were more aggressive than those who failed. Such findings suggest two possibilities. 1. Competition generates aggression as a result of something other than its capacity to frustrate participants. Or, 2. Even winning is not enough to eradicate the frustrating elements of competition. The authors of the second study prefer the latter hypothesis. Whether successful or not, competition is considered a frustrating experience because of the threat of defeat and the unpredictability of the outcome. In any case, it is quite clear that the hostile encounter called competition, on the playing field and in other contexts, for both participants and spectators, leads us to become more aggressive. RX, cooperation. Competition is the worst possible arrangement as far as relationship is concerned. There may be drawbacks to working or playing or learning independently, but at least this does not place us in the position of viewing each other as enemies. Happily, though, we do not have to settle for the lesser evil of isolation. There is a third approach, cooperation, which has a powerful positive effect on relationship. Chapter 3 showed that working together is more productive. Now I want to emphasize a somewhat less surprising but equally consequential finding. When we cooperate, we are inclined to like each other more. Even in a mercilessly competitive society, there are pockets of cooperative activity, enough, at least, so that each of us knows what it is to work with others to paint a room, prepare a report, cook a meal. To remember such experiences is to know that cooperation encourages us to view our collaborators favorably. It is to understand how cooperation teaches us, more broadly, the value of relationship. Cooperation means that the success of each participant is linked to that of every other. This structure tends to lead to mutual assistance and support, which, in turn, predisposes cooperators to feel an affinity for one another. At the very least, cooperation offers an opportunity to interact positively, which independent effort does not and which competition actively discourages. At the most, it provides an irresistible inducement to do so. There is by now an impressive pile of studies substantiating these conclusions, but their findings seem so predictable that I will review them only briefly. David and Roger Johnson conducted a precise statistical analysis of 98 studies on this issue published between 1944 and 1982. Their collective finding, cooperative experiences promote more positive relationships among individuals from different ethnic backgrounds, between handicapped and non-handicapped individuals, and more homogeneous individuals than do the alternative arrangements cooperation with intergroup competition, interpersonal competition, and individualistic experiences. As of 1985, the Johnsons themselves had conducted 37 studies of interpersonal attraction under different learning arrangements. 35 of them clearly showed that cooperation promoted greater attraction, while the results were mixed in the other two. Interpersonal attraction is a catch-all phrase that stands for quite a number of positive effects. Among them, encouragement given. Research by Brenda Bryant discovered that children who worked cooperatively more actively encouraged and supported the self-enhancement of others than children from a competitive or individualistic learning environment. Encouragement received. Other studies have shown that students perceive such encouragement and support from their peers in a cooperative setup. Sensitivity. Gillian King and Richard Sorrentino found more sensitivity to the needs of others displayed in cooperation. Their experimental subjects also reported that cooperative situations were much more pleasant than competitive situations. Other orientation. Children can more readily move beyond a self-centered orientation and begin to take others into account once they are placed in a cooperative environment, reported Emmy Pepitone and her colleagues. Perspective-taking, cooperation, as I noted earlier in this chapter, is by far the best way to promote perspective-taking. People tend to see things from the other person's point of view when they are working with, rather than against, each other. Communication is improved through cooperation. Deutsch's classic experiment with undergraduates showed that when students worked cooperatively, more ideas were verbalized, and members were more attentive to one another. They had fewer difficulties in communicating with or understanding others. With competition, Deutsch adds, communication tends to be unreliable and impoverished. Trust, even when individuals have unequal power, as represented in an experimental game, they tend to trust each other in a cooperative structure. Trust is virtually absent under competition. Some of the most exciting research in this field concerns the effect of cooperation on students who are different from one another. It says quite a bit if any two people will come to like each other as a result of having cooperated on something. But it says far more if the same thing happens with people of different abilities or ethnic backgrounds. Research from the 1940s and 1950s suggested that Interaction within a cooperative context was a major determinant of whether cross-ethnic contact produced positive attitudes and relationships. And later work has confirmed this. Simply bringing together children from different backgrounds does not produce harmony, as a chorus of bitter voices never tires of pointing out. But instead of simply indicting desegregation, or worse, abandoning it, it seems more sensible to investigate what happens to students once they are in the same classroom. Whereas competition creates an atmosphere of hostility and does nothing to overcome differences, cooperation builds bridges. Its capacity for encouraging positive regard is no less potent when the cooperators are from different backgrounds, as the studies show quite clearly. And this effect is not limited to class projects. Once cooperative learning brings children together, they continue to enjoy spending time with each other. After the lessons are over, students in cooperative classrooms socialize more heterogeneously than those in competitive or independent learning situations. In all, cooperation points the way to what child development researcher Urie Bronfenbrenner once called a curriculum of caring. Implicit in all of this is a truth that many people may find disconcerting. How we feel about other people is often put down, rather vaguely, to chemistry, not a subject for social science research, but a beguiling mystery to be wondered at by poets and songwriters. Even if we are willing to scrutinize patterns in our relationships, we tend to see them as a function of other people's behavior and personality. We like people who are likable. But the implication of what I have been reporting in this chapter is that our attitudes about others are largely dependent on the structure in which we interact. I do not mean to suggest that an individual's actions are irrelevant to how I regard her. Neither do I believe that science can, or should, eliminate all mystery from what happens between two people, or reduce the uniqueness of each relationship to generalizable laws. Still, there is no escaping the fact that the texture of our relationships depends to a significant degree on the context in which we come to know each other. I will look very different to someone for whom I am a rival than to someone for whom I am a partner. Of course, not all competitors will be lifelong enemies, just as not all cooperators will develop enduring friendships. But a predisposition toward hostility or attraction undeniably develops as a result of the structure under which we deal with one another. That is what the evidence, and if we think about it, our own experience, demonstrates. We versus they. The benefits of cooperation are so compelling that it seems even a competitive society must take notice. But how can such a society allow its members to taste the fruits of working together while still socializing them to keep the larger competitive framework? The answer is intergroup cooperation with intergroup competition. Work with some others, but do so in order to defeat everyone else. This is about as close as some of us ever get to genuine cooperation. I would argue that it represents a rather unsatisfying compromise. Better than competition at every level, but not as good as competition at no level. The conventional wisdom in a competitive culture, by contrast, is that intergroup competition heightens, or perhaps is even required for, cooperation within the group. Whatever is to be gained by cooperating depends on working to defeat a common enemy. Every we needs a they. Is this true? Recall that when studies found performance was enhanced by intergroup cooperation, people asked whether this effect actually relied on intergroup competition. The answer was unequivocally no. Such competition either was irrelevant to the cooperation-generated productivity or actually diminished it. The same seems to be true here. Intergroup competition is not necessary for intergroup cooperation to draw people together. Robert Dunn and Morton Goldman set out to test this question with college students in 1966. They found, first, that intergroup competition led subjects to view those from other groups negatively, and second, that intergroup competition was not helpful in developing feelings of acceptance within each group. Such rivalry, they concluded, may not only be unnecessary, but may do social harm through the intergroup tensions that it arouses. The Johnsons, too, paid attention to this issue when they analyzed the results of scores of studies on interpersonal attraction. They found that subjects tended to like each other more where cooperation did not take place in the context of intergroup competition. Finally, A 1985 study confirmed that intergroup cooperation promoted more positive cross-ethnic and cross-sex relationships than did intergroup competition. These results disconfirm the position that competition among groups leads to attraction among collaborators. And they provide some support for the position that the more pervasive the cooperation, the greater the interpersonal attraction. If these data seem surprising, it may be because we have confounded interpersonal attraction with group unity. The latter is associated with loyalty to the group as such, and often with uniformity among its members. Thus, the citizens of a nation will indeed wave their flags more vigorously when they have been persuaded that another nation poses a threat. This phenomenon is not at all what I have been discussing. Allegiance to a country or school or corporation does not necessarily promote sensitivity, trust, better perspective taking, and so on among those in the group. Conversely, liking the individuals in my group does not mean I will reify and then glorify the group itself. Intergroup competition may be necessary for chauvinism, but not for relationship. There is another reason that intergroup competition does not promote cooperation. Just as competition spreads from the workplace to the home, so it leaks from intergroup to intragroup level. This is partly the result of generalization of learning. It is not so easy to view some people as competitors, with all the attendant hostility, and then wipe away this orientation with respect to other people, those on the same team. The proof is in the furious competition for starting positions or higher salaries among athletes on the same team. This pervasive phenomenon does not mean that competition is an irrepressible part of human nature. It means that the most effective way to set up cooperation does not involve tacking on competition at another level. Far better is cooperation at both the intergroup and intragroup levels. When hostility mounted during the Robbers Cave experiment, Sharif at first tried to unite the two teams by having them combine forces to beat a team from another camp. It didn't work. The short-term effects of this common enemy were to induce cooperation for our camp to beat theirs. However, when the common enemy was gone, the two rivals quickly retreated to their own in-groups, still unwilling to cooperate in other activities across group lines. Further, had we continued the common enemy approach, we would have ended by merely enlarging the scope of the generalized effects of win-lose competition that had already occurred within our camp. In effect, we would have had a bigger war. Sharif finally did end the vicious rivalry between Rattlers and Eagles by setting up superordinate goals for the boys to meet. These were tasks, such as pulling a truck up a hill or fixing the water supply system, in which the two groups had to cooperate, but without competing against anyone else. Up until now, I have been arguing that intergroup competition is not necessary for cooperation. Now I want to add that this arrangement is also positively undesirable. Consider the case of celebrating one's hometown. There is nothing offensive about the slogan, "I love New York," except, perhaps, its dilution of the word love. This straightforward affirmation, however, is unusual today. Far more common is the defiant assertion that one city is number one. As Michael Parenti has observed, the lack of a sense of community does not prevent Americans from identifying with larger collective entities such as a school, a town, or the nation. But even this identification is expressed in terms that are competitive with other schools, towns, or nations. And Frank Trippett, in a Time magazine essay that chucklingly approves of such competition, acknowledges that local chauvinism habitually thrives on the disparagement of rival places or areas. In a competitive culture, it is not sufficient to say that one is glad to live where one does. One must derogate all other towns and shout oneself hoarse about one's own town's being the best. Our usual reaction is, with Trippett, to dismiss such rivalry as harmless fun. This is also the prevailing view of sports, and, for that matter, of any other competition that stops short of killing. But the sort of affirmation that is concerned with besting others, the sort of camaraderie that develops from working to beat another group, or from simply proclaiming the superiority of one's own, has an ugliness about it that I believe is intrinsically objectionable. Camaraderie is desirable, all things being equal. But all things are not equal when the feeling is derived from derogating an outgroup. As to the defense that it is all in fun, I am reminded of the person who cruelly taunts someone and then remonstrates. But I was only kidding! Beyond such principled objections are the practical problems. Sharif's fear of starting a bigger war is worth taking very seriously. The we versus they structure and the attitude that accompanies it are, after all, at the heart of every war. It is one thing to feel hostile in a contest that pits one individual against another. It is something else again to stoke the aggressive fires that rage in group rivalries. One need not believe aggression is inevitable in human life to point out how horrible are the results of multiplying hatred by the number of people in a group. More, the whole of competitive fury, like that of cooperative creativity, is greater than the sum of its parts. It is not readily apparent how we can end the awful legacy of nationalism, the tensions among countries that now threaten our very existence. But it is quite certain the answer does not lie in more rivalry, even the kind that is supposed to be good-natured. After dinner, speakers urge us to rechannel our military competition into an effort to be number one in scientific or cultural endeavors. However uncontroversial this may sound at first hearing, it actually makes no more sense than the catharsis theory from which it borrows. Never mind that international scientific competition is likely to be far less productive than cooperation. The point here is that competition of any kind establishes an antagonism that contributes to, rather than deflects, feelings of hostility. The same is true for the Olympics, as George Orwell saw nearly 40 years ago, even if one didn't know from concrete examples that international sporting contests lead to orgies of hatred, one could deduce it from general principles. The whole thing is bound up with the rise of nationalism, that is, with the lunatic modern habit of identifying oneself with large power units and seeing everything in terms of competitive prestige. I do not, of course, suggest that sport is one of the main causes of international rivalry. Big-scale sport is itself, I think, merely another effect of the causes that have produced nationalism. Still, you do make things worse by sending forth a team to do battle against some rival team, and allowing it to be felt on all sides that whichever nation is defeated will lose face. Intergroup competition is too high a price to pay for intragroup cooperation, and it is fortunate that it does not have to be paid. Intergroup competition also is not the way to bring harmony and good fellowship to a brittle planet. Far more sensible is the premise that we should expand cooperation so as to include as many people as possible rather than restricting it to one's in-group. There are enough problems, enough superordinate goals, to occupy us indefinitely, and our work on them will have the felicitous consequence of binding us together if we join in solving them. Even if no individual can actively cooperate with everyone, he surely can approach others prepared to cooperate. Students can learn together in groups, and then share their insights with other groups. Cities can work together on common problems rather than yelling about which is the best place to live or abasing themselves in a competition for corporate favors. Finally, we can heed Roderick Gorney's declaration that our ultimate safety depends only upon enlarging the circles of helpful cooperation, one last step to encompass our largest units, the nations. Constructive conflict. To cooperate, as I have tried to show in earlier chapters, is not to sacrifice either an achievement orientation or a strong sense of self. On the contrary, success will more likely be the result of working with other people, and the same might be said for healthy self-esteem. Here I would like to rescue cooperation from yet another misconception. It does not imply some idyllic state of harmony among participants. To the question, "But how do you expect people to agree on everything?" we answer, they won't. And that's why a cooperative framework for dealing with disagreement is so critical. Conflict, per se, is not harmful. In fact, its absence suggests people who are frightened to challenge a superior, resentful, or bereft of their rational faculties, as the total agreement among cult members demonstrates. Children know that disagreement exists. To force them to agree in a classroom is to ask them to deny reality, and it is to deprive them of a real education. It is no coincidence that the word challenge means both to require someone to use her full range of abilities and to call something into question. Genuine learning does not smooth over or soothe. The same is true of effective problem solving. A rigid demand for agreement means that people will effectively be prevented from contributing their wisdom to a group effort. What makes disagreement destructive is not the fact of conflict itself, but the addition of competition. In a debate, as opposed to a discussion or dialogue, the point is to win rather than to reach the best solution or arrive at a compromise with which everyone is satisfied. Listen in at a board meeting or a dinner party, and you can hear the difference between someone's participating in an exchange of ideas and someone's trying to score points. Both are examples of conflict, but only one involves competition. Morton Deutsch spelled out the distinction. A cooperative process leads to the defining of conflicting interests as a mutual problem to be solved by collaborative effort. It facilitates the recognition of the legitimacy of each other's interests and of the necessity of searching for a solution that is responsive to the needs of all. It tends to limit rather than expand the scope of conflicting interests. In contrast, a competitive process stimulates the view that the solution of conflict can only be one that is imposed by one side on the other, through superior force, deceptions, or cleverness. The enhancement of one's own power and the minimization of the legitimacy of the other side's interests in the situation become objectives. When Deutsch refers to the use of superior force to resolve competitive conflict, he is not talking only about firepower. Tyranny of the majority usually takes place through voting. Trying to round up votes for one's position or candidate has more in common with coercion by force than it does with working cooperatively to achieve consensus. One of the reasons that conflict nested in competition can be ended only by some appeal to power is that competition interferes with communication. The difference between cooperation and competition is the difference between listening to each other's points of view and twisting each other's arms. Cooperative conflict represents what Roger and David Johnson have called friendly excursions into disequilibrium, and their classroom studies have made three things clear. 1. Students like it. In one study, arguing was less upsetting to 5th and 6th graders who participated in cooperative conflict than to those who had not. In another, students were more enthused about cooperative conflict than about either independent learning or a concurrence seeking model in which discussion was inhibited so as to minimize disagreement. There was considerable dislike for debate in a third study, while not a single objection was raised against cooperative conflict. 2. Students learned from it. Achievement tests revealed better comprehension under cooperative conflict than under concurrence seeking or independent learning. A second study confirmed that this was true for high dash, middle dash, and low ability subjects. 3. It promotes interpersonal attraction. There were greater feelings of peer academic support and personal acceptance, and greater accuracy of perspective taking in cooperative conflict than in concurrence seeking, debate, or independent learning situations. This last finding may be the most compelling. We feel better about each other when we air our differences than when we pretend everyone agrees. But such an airing must take place in the context of working with, rather than against, each other. Structural cooperation is not at all inimical to conflict. It simply allows conflict to work most productively by keeping out the poisonous hostilities of a win-slash-lose arrangement.
They told us from the start, life's a race to win. Climb the ladder, guard your heart, don't let no one in. But what if there's another way, a path we've never tried? Where rising up means lifting those who walk right by our side. We're better together, not made to compete. Stronger in harmony, not in defeat. No need to measure the norm. No contest, no rivalry, no need to be the best. Just honest hearts and open arms, let go of all the rest. The world is wide enough for all to find their place. Let's build a better way where kindness wins the race. We're better together to lead. True success blossoms in meeting the need. A world where we care, where no one's left out. That's what this love can be all about. Cooperation's the key that unlocks the door. Together we shine, not rich versus poor. So here's to the dreamers who dare to be kind in a world built on love, not just who's aligned. The game is not winning, it's how we all play. Let's choose connection and start a new way. Imagine no competition, a world where we cooperate. Try to think of it if you can. Wouldn't it be great? Imagine everyone living for the here and now. Imagine no war, no borders, bombs, or fear, no armies or flags, just the voice of love near. Imagine everyone living peacefully. Some people call me a dreamer, but I'm not the only one who believes in peace. I hope you'll look up the Venus Project. When we unify, the world will live as one. Imagine no religion, no dogmas to divide, no judgment or exclusion, just science as a guide. Imagine no politics, no left or right or spin, no puppets serving power, but truth that flows from within. Imagine no pollution, no smog filling the air, just open minds and kindness, and no modern art giving us despair. Imagine everyone sharing our planet Earth. Some people call me a dreamer, but I'm not the only one who believes in peace. I hope you look up the Venus Project. When we unify, the world will be as one.
I'm Chinese.
I am Russian.
I am East African.
I'm Canadian.
I am Filipina.
I am Irish.
I am Bulgarian.
Korean.
I am American.
I am Brazilian.
Italian.
Mexican.
I'm British.
Swedish.
French.
I'm Israeli.
Japanese.
We are mankind.
The world I see is fair and free, where people can travel wherever they please, and children can eat and have shoes on their feet, and not be afraid when they walk on the street. It's not like there has to be rainbows and bunnies, or streets full of people all dancing like dummies, but freedom to live, to learn, and to play, to just be yourself and think your own way. The road I see may sound crazy to you, but hopefully, someday, you'll see it too.